The security guard's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Sir, you need to move along. This area is for VIP guests only." The old man in the worn flannel shirt looked up from his coffee, confusion clouding his weathered face. Around him, tech executives in $1,000 suits whispered and pointed, their laughter cruel and sharp. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where ordinary moments reveal extraordinary truths about the human spirit. Today, we share a story that will forever change how you see the invisible people around you. A story about respect, recognition, and the power of one simple gesture to silence a room full of doubters. Let's uncover what really happened at the Tesla Gigafactory opening ceremony in Austin, Texas, when the world's richest man stopped everything to honor someone everyone else had dismissed. The morning started like any other for Frank Morrison. At 73, he'd been retired for 8 years from his job as a night janitor at a small electronics factory. His routine was simple: coffee at sunrise, a walk through the neighborhood, and quiet hours tending to his vegetable garden. But today was different. Today he held a crumpled invitation in his weathered hands. His granddaughter Sarah had somehow secured him a spot at Tesla's grand opening. She worked in tech marketing and knew how much her grandfather admired innovation, even if he'd never owned anything more advanced than a flip phone. "Grandpa, you always talk about how amazing these new inventions are," she'd said. "This is your chance to see the future being built." Frank had protested. What would an old janitor do at such a fancy event? But Sarah insisted, and Frank had learned long ago never to disappoint his granddaughter. So here he was, standing outside the gleaming gigafactory, clutching his invitation and feeling completely out of place. The security checkpoint buzzed with activity. Men and women in expensive suits breezed through, their VIP badges gleaming. Frank approached slowly, his invitation slightly wrinkled from his nervous grip. The guard barely glanced at it before waving him through, but Frank caught the eye roll, the dismissive glance at his simple clothes. Inside, the contrast was even starker. The factory floor had been transformed into an elegant reception area. Servers in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and canapes. Frank accepted a cup of coffee and found a quiet corner, content to observe the marvel of engineering surrounding him. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to a young woman in a designer dress, her tone dripping with condescension. "I think you might be in the wrong section. The general public tour doesn't start until this afternoon." Frank smiled politely. "I have an invitation, miss. My granddaughter—" "Look, I'm sure she's lovely, but this is a very exclusive event. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the visitor center?" She gestured toward the exit, her smile as fake as her sympathy. Others began to take notice. A group of executives nearby turned to watch, their conversations dying as they focused on the old man who clearly didn't belong. Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he stood his ground. "I was invited," he repeated quietly, pulling out his phone to show the email confirmation Sarah had forwarded to him. The woman barely glanced at it. "Those can be faked, you know." "Security!" She raised her voice, and suddenly Frank found himself the center of unwanted attention. The security guard, who'd checked Frank's invitation earlier, approached, his expression stern. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." "But I showed you my invitation," Frank protested, his voice growing smaller as more people gathered around. "The invitation system must have glitched," the woman in the designer dress announced to the growing crowd. "This gentleman clearly doesn't belong here." The whispers started then, rippling through the crowd like poison. "How did he get in? Security is really slipping. Someone like that at a Tesla event?" The words hit Frank like physical blows, each one stealing a piece of his dignity. Frank Morrison had faced many humiliations in his 73 years. He'd grown up poor, worked multiple jobs to support his family, and endured the subtle dismissals that came with being a janitor in a world that valued appearance over character. But standing there, surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than an embarrassment to be removed, he felt smaller than ever. "Please," he said quietly to the security guard. My granddaughter, Sarah Williams, sent me this invitation. She works for Technomark Solutions. You can call her. The guard's radio crackled to life, saving him from having to respond. A voice announced that the main presentation would begin in 5 minutes. The crowd began to shift toward the presentation area, but the guard remained focused on Frank. Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the premises. We can't have any disruptions during Mr. Musk's presentation. Frank nodded slowly, the fight leaving him. He'd survived worse than this. He'd go home, tend to his garden, and pretend this had never happened. Sarah would never need to know how her kind gesture had ended. He turned toward the exit, his shoulders sagging with defeat. The crowd parted around him like he was carrying a disease, their relief at his departure palpable. Frank had almost reached the door when a voice behind him called out, "Excuse me, sir in the flannel shirt." Frank turned, expecting another security guard or perhaps someone else, eager to ensure his removal. Instead, he found himself face to face with a man in a simple black t-shirt and jeans. The man was younger than Frank's own son, with an intense gaze and an air of quiet authority that seemed to electrify the air around him. The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every phone lowered. Even the security guard froze mid-step. "Elon Musk," the man said, extending his hand to Frank. "And you are?" Frank stared at the outstretched hand, his mind struggling to process what was happening. This was Elon Musk. The Elon Musk. The man whose factory they were standing in, whose vision had created the very building around them. "Frank Morrison, sir," he managed, shaking the offered hand. "Frank Morrison," Elon repeated, and something in his expression shifted. "Frank Morrison, from Morrison Electronics Supply." Frank's eyes widened. Morrison Electronics Supply had been his late brother's small business, a tiny operation that specialized in hard-to-find electronic components. Frank had helped out occasionally, mostly with deliveries and basic repairs, but the business had closed years ago when his brother passed away. "You knew my brother's company?" Frank asked, disbelief coloring his voice. Elon smiled, and the entire room seemed to lean in to catch his next words. "Knew it? Frank, your brother's company saved one of my earliest ventures. Back in 1995, when I was starting Zip2, we had a critical component failure. Every major supplier said it would take weeks to get the part we needed. Your brother not only had it in stock, he drove it to our office himself on a Sunday night." The room was so quiet, Frank could hear his own heartbeat. Around them, the same people who had been demanding his removal now stared in stunned silence. "My brother never mentioned that," Frank said softly. "Good men rarely mention their good deeds," Elon replied. "That component kept us running during our most crucial period. Without it, without your brother's help, Zip2 might never have succeeded. And without Zip2, he gestured around the massive factory, none of this might exist." Frank felt tears welling in his eyes. His brother had died 5 years earlier, never knowing the impact of that simple act of kindness. "I've been looking for a way to honor your brother's contribution for years," Elon continued. "I tried to find him, to thank him properly, but the business had closed. I never thought I'd have the chance to meet his family." The designer-dressed woman who had first challenged Frank now looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The security guard stood frozen, his radio forgotten in his hand. The executives who had whispered and pointed now avoided eye contact entirely. "Frank," Elon said, "would you do me the honor of being my personal guest today? I'd love to show you around the factory, and I have some stories about your brother that I think you'd enjoy hearing." Frank nodded, unable to speak. Elon placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "I'd like you to meet Frank Morrison, whose family's dedication to service and innovation helped make this day possible. Frank, would you mind if we took a photo together? I'd like to share this moment with the world, As cameras flashed and phones captured the moment, Frank Morrison stood beside one of the most famous men on Earth, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. The same people who had wanted him removed now pressed forward, eager to be associated with the moment. But Frank barely noticed them. All he could think about was his brother, and how a simple act of kindness performed decades ago had rippled forward through time to create this impossible moment. The tour that followed was unlike anything Frank had ever experienced. Elon personally guided him through the factory floor, explaining the revolutionary manufacturing processes, the robotic assembly lines, and the vision behind sustainable transportation. But more importantly, he shared stories about Frank's brother. He never asked for payment up front, Elon recalled, as they watched robots assembling battery packs with precise efficiency. Most suppliers demanded cash before delivery, especially from a startup like ours, but your brother said, "Pay me when you can. Right now, you need to focus on building something great." Frank learned that his brother had provided components for several other early tech companies, always with the same generous terms, always with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. He'd been a silent patron of innovation, supporting dreamers and builders without ever seeking recognition. As the official presentation began, Frank found himself seated in the front row, introduced to the audience as an honored guest whose family helped build the foundation of American innovation. The applause was thunderous, genuine, and deeply moving. After the presentation, people approached Frank throughout the afternoon, not to dismiss him or question his presence, but to hear more about his brother's business, to understand how one man's kindness had helped shape the future. The woman in the designer dress was among them, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine shame and curiosity. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I made assumptions. That was wrong of me." Frank accepted her apology with the same grace he'd shown throughout the ordeal. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. "The important thing is learning from them." As the event wound down, Elon found Frank again. "I have something for you," he said, presenting a small wooden box. Inside was the very component that Frank's brother had delivered that Sunday night in 1995, along with a handwritten note from Elon. "To Frank Morrison and the memory of his brother," the note read. "Thank you for teaching me that the greatest innovations come not from genius alone, but from the kindness and dedication of ordinary people doing extraordinary things." Frank held the component carefully, his eyes wet with tears. "My brother would have been so proud," he whispered. "He should be proud," Elon corrected, "and so should you. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Frank. Your granddaughter Sarah speaks of you with the same respect and admiration I felt for your brother. She says you taught her that true success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by how you treat others along the way." The drive home was quiet, Frank's mind replaying the day's events. The humiliation of the morning felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the profound connection he'd discovered with his brother's legacy. But more than that, he'd witnessed something powerful about human nature. The same people who had dismissed him when they thought he was nobody had celebrated him once they learned of his connection to success. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly judgment could shift, how fragile human dignity could be, and how important it was to see the worth in every person, regardless of their appearance or apparent status. That evening, Frank called his granddaughter Sarah to thank her for the invitation. When he told her about meeting Elon Musk, about learning of her great-uncle's impact on history, she was amazed. But when he described the morning's humiliation, her voice grew angry. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I should have prepared you better, should have—" "No, sweetheart," Frank interrupted gently. "Today taught me something important. Your great-uncle lived his whole life believing that every person has value, that every act of kindness matters, even if we never see its impact. Today, I got to see that philosophy in action, and I got to learn that even when people forget your worth, the universe has a way of remembering." Frank Morrison returned to his quiet life. But he was changed. The photo of him with Elon Musk, shared across social media platforms, became a symbol of something larger than either man had intended. It reminded people to look beyond appearances, to recognize that everyone carries invisible stories of contribution and worth. The old man in the flannel shirt was no longer invisible, but more importantly, he'd helped others see that none of us should be. In a world quick to judge and dismiss, Frank Morrison's story became a reminder that dignity isn't determined by designer clothes or VIP status, but by the content of our character and the legacy of our actions. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not in factories or laboratories, but in moments when we choose to see each other's humanity. And sometimes the most important innovations aren't technological at all, but the simple recognition that every person, regardless of their appearance or status, has a story worth telling and a value worth honoring. Frank Morrison learned that day that he had never been a nobody. He'd simply been surrounded by people who had forgotten how to see. And in being seen, truly seen, by one of the world's most visible figures, he'd reminded everyone watching that we all deserve the same recognition, the same respect, and the same basic human dignity. The greatest gift isn't always what we receive, but what we help others discover about themselves. And sometimes the most grateful stories are the ones that teach us to be grateful for each other.